Well, thanks for inviting me. When Thera reached out, I was really excited to hear that people are still thinking about this, even though it's gotten a little quiet since our pilot wrapped up and all the recommendations were submitted to the legislature. So it's great. The important thing is to keep talking about this because it's far from over. And in fact, we don't have a program yet in law. So there's a lot of time to continue to shape and refine. So really appreciate your guys' interest today. I'm going to start off by talking just briefly about the problem we're facing with the gas tax long term. This is just a overly simplified snapshot of how the current 49.4-cent gas tax is distributed across the state. And you'll see the 9.5 cents and the nickel, and then that 11.9 connecting Washington. Those are all three packages, revenue packages the legislature enacted. Of course, the connecting Washington package was the last one in 2015. The nickel was done in 2003, and then they came back in 05 and did the 9.5 cents. So you can see those are there, and the reason we show those is those dollars, when they do those packages, largely get committed upfront by the legislature to a specified project list. So they, in essence, pre-spend the money they're anticipating collecting over usually a 16-year period. So a lot of that comes off the table immediately, even though, and that creates this perception from the public standpoint that, well, you've been raising our gas tax. Why do you keep telling us there's not enough money? The issue is that those dollars are going to great projects that are, as you can see in the bottom line here, there's only 8 cents left on the table of that 49.4 to pay for maintenance and preservation and safety improvements and operations and all the other things we need to do with our transportation system. So those dedications are a big chunk of dollars that go towards projects. And of course, then you've got the cities and counties getting their cut, and then about 4 cents is going to pay off prior debt. The other challenge we face as we look at the gas tax and its lack of sustainability is just the changing auto vehicle fleet. We know that electric vehicles are with us. They're going to be growing. The automakers have very strong plans to really transition their fleet to being all electric over the next decade. And Bloomberg is one of the sources we monitor for the market assessment of where prices will go with electric vehicles. I mean, today they're significantly more expensive than an equivalent gas-powered car, which is, creates a hurdle for a lot of folks to make that transition over to an EV. But Bloomberg has been estimating since 2017 when they think that crossover point or that price parity point will be reached with electric vehicles, that they would be of similar price to their combustion engine counterparts. And as you can see in 2017, they were really pushing it out into the late 2020s. But as you can see, where we are today is that they expect that crossover price parity point to be hit by 2022. That's largely going to be we think the bigger vehicles like pickup trucks and others, but the passenger cars are more likely to follow suit later this decade. But for sure by 2030, we expect prices to be pretty equivalent, and that's going to be a big encouragement to accelerate consumers to consider purchasing an electric vehicle and getting rid of their gas-powered car. So we expect this to accelerate year to year and to see big changes overall in our fleet makeup by the end of the decade. What this all means for our gas tax revenues is that we're going to see a very significant decline when we reach this transition. The top line indicates our state's vehicle MPG. At the far left, you can see the current average today is 20.5 miles per gallon. And our state forecasters conservatively estimate that by 2035, our state MPG average will increase to 35 miles per gallon. We think that's going to come sooner and grow much more rapidly than being estimated. However, if we use that assumption, you can see that equates to about a 45% decline in our gas tax revenues for our state highway system. And I will note that the gas tax is dedicated under the state constitution's 18th Amendment to be used for highway purposes. It is by far the provider of the lion's share of revenues that come in for our roads and bridges and our ferry system. So a potential solution that has emerged is road usage charging. And we've been looking at this and assessing this since 2012, when the legislature directed the commission to begin an assessment and identify a sustainable long-term revenue source for Washington State's transportation system. And the key here has been a consistent direction from the legislature has been that it will be a transition from the current gas tax and will be a replacement. So this is not an addition to the gas tax or an add-on. It is solely being looked at as a replacement to the gas tax. The basis of the assessment, we established a steering committee made up of stakeholders and legislators. About 30 people are serving on it. It remains in place today. The road usage charge rate that we tested in our pilot and that we've used in all of our financial analysis has been 2.4 cents a mile. And you can see below how we got to that, but you can figure out what you're paying by the mile a day with your vehicle by simply taking the state gas tax and dividing it by your car's MPG and noting the state average of 20 miles per gallon. That equates to about 2.4 cents a mile that drivers are paying today on average. When we did our pilot, which I'll talk about in a minute, it was a simulation of a real system. We did not collect real money. We've assumed revenue neutrality, and we have focused on net revenue potential for both the road charge and the gas tax over 24 years. We've assumed, again, drivers would pay only the road charge or the gas tax, but not both. And all of our work is focused on the light duty vehicles only. We have not looked at heavy trucks. So a real quick snapshot of our pilot. It went on for 12 months. It ran largely through 2018 into early 2019, where 2,000 drivers from all over the state volunteered to test our road charge system we had built. We also had participants from the city of Surrey, British Columbia. I'll note that this work was federally funded, and so we had to be mindful of not just what things interested Washington State, but we also wanted to produce research and results that would benefit the national discussion, which is also started around the gas taxes, the federal gas taxes sustainability, and this potentially being an option for the nation to shift to. So of course, with us having one of the busiest border crossings in the country, we really want to understand what would that mean if British Columbia also had a road charge and we had a road charge? How would we reconcile that on an international basis? They too are looking at road charging, so this became an interesting point of testing. We also had drivers from the state of Idaho participate to get more experience and data on that cross-border travel within states. And lastly, we had a pretty robust experiment with the Oregon Department of Transportation. Oregon is the first state and only one of two in the nation that have an actual road usage charge program on the books today in operation. It's currently a voluntary program. And so they do have about, I think about 1,500 drivers that are paying the road charge in lieu of gas tax. And so we partnered with them to do our nation's first cash transactional test. So in this case, we did collect real money with this very small pool of drivers. And we had drivers from Oregon, about 70 of them who have RUC accounts with real money in it, who drive into the state of Washington, test our system. And then we had about 30 drivers from Clark County agree to pay real money and who drove into Oregon quite a bit so we could test this cross-border travel in real terms and see how we could transact and reconcile our dollars between our two states, given that we have different gas tax rates, we have different RUC rates. So the complexity was there, and the good news is that it worked out really well, but we learned a lot that will inform the national discussion around how road charging may get deployed nationally if Congress doesn't put a program in place and you have a situation of states kind of doing this on their own in a patchwork kind of way. How would that work? This will inform that. Lastly, one of our key partners in all this work has been the Seattle Electric Vehicle Association and Plug in America. The electric vehicle community is a very important partner in this work, given that this will impact them initially the most as we think about switching over from the flat fee they currently pay. We tested 5 options in our pilot, 5 different ways of collecting miles from drivers. On the left side, you can see those 2 did not involve technology or GPS. The mileage permit, you can see only had 1% of our 2,000 drivers sign up for that. So not a lot of interest in that. That was kind of similar to what you could think of as like a prepaid cell phone where drivers could buy a permit of a block of miles and pay for it and then drive until their permit ran out. Above that was the odometer reading approach, which 28% of our drivers chose. This is more of a post-pay experience where drivers drove and in the pilot on a quarterly basis, they were asked to take a picture of their odometer with their cell phone and text it in, or they could go to a DOL licensing office and have them do it for them if they didn't have a smartphone or didn't want to do that. But it worked really well. And the one drawback of this one is drivers that choose this were paying in a simulated way on all their miles because there was no way to know how much of their miles was off of public roadways or was out of state. So that's one of the trade-offs drivers had to think about when they signed up for this. On the right side is where we deploy the use of GPS and more technology. The Mile Mapper smartphone app was the first app developed in the country that would utilize a smartphone as the gizmo to collect and remit your miles. We developed the smartphone app with students at the University of Washington and created a beta app. We capped participation at 14% because it was a beta and we didn't know if it would work. So we certainly didn't want to spend our federal dollars on a failure, so we limited it. But the good news is it worked really well, and it's provided a lot of insight into how this technology may advance into the future. And lastly, the plug-in devices were offered. This is a small device that plugs into your car's OBD2 port below your steering wheel column. Pay-as-you-go insurance companies are using these devices. This is how Oregon and the state of Utah, which is the second state in the country to have implemented a road charge program, they use these two options. One device is enabled with GPS, the other is not. As you can see on the percentages, 37% of our drivers chose the GPS option, but 19% chose it without. When you combine the 19 with the 28 on the odometer reading, that's about half of our pilot drivers chose options that did not involve GPS. That was a really important takeaway for lawmakers to consider as they think about advancing this program and the importance of having consumer choice in how they would participate. At a very high level, what we heard from our drivers over the 12 months of our pilot, we collected over 15 million miles that were reported and charged at the 2.4-cent rate. It worked flawlessly. We didn't have any issues on the operations. We did 3 surveys of our participants. We sent one at the beginning of the pilot, one at the middle, and then one at the end, and kind of got their evolving viewpoints and input on their experience with the road charge program. What they liked and didn't like was captured. We also held 6 focus groups around the state to get more detailed input. We got over 1,900 emails and phone calls. Interestingly, 38% of those came from members of the public who were not in the pilot. So a pretty high level of interest generically from the public about what it was and what it was about. No surprise on the concerns. People were raising questions and concerns around privacy and data collection and how that's protected, compliance and administrative costs, fairness and equity, how we are going to travel between states, and operational viability. Some key findings of our assessment so far is that one thing we know about road charging is it's really giving us the opportunity to harmonize currently conflicting state policies. Right now, our state relies heavily on the gas tax, which requires drivers continue to consume a lot of fossil fuel. Meanwhile, we have goals in law that would reduce fossil fuel consumption and reduce VMT and emissions. These are in direct conflict and really force a false policy choice around, do we want better roads or a better environment? That shouldn't be the case. And in road charging, we can resolve that. Represents an opportunity to reduce barriers of adoption by electric vehicles through the rate setting mechanism. For example, EVs today are paying $225 a year to register their cars. It's the highest fee in the nation. Hybrid drivers started paying $75 per year last year as well. The commission is recommending that the legislature waive those for those drivers that want to join the road charge program instead. RUP can also advance fairness because it allows drivers to pay for what they're using truly rather than what they own or paying that flat gas tax that is not adjustable based on your ability to pay or your ability or the kind of car you drive and your ability to afford a cleaner vehicle. And lastly, RUC will provide a reliable long-term funding source by removing budgetary reliance on that consumption of fossil fuel while preserving that user pay model that we've used in this country for over a century. One of the other things we've learned is that taxing by the gallon has real fairness and equity challenges. This chart really shows it simplistically. If you notice that yellow dot there plotted in the middle, that is the 20.5 mile per gallon average for our state drivers of our fleet. If you drive a car that falls in that blue quadrant where you're getting below that average 20 miles per gallon, you could be paying as much as 4 to 6 cents a mile today to use the roadways. Meanwhile, if you're driving a car that falls in that green quadrant where you're getting above that 20 miles per gallon, you could be paying as little as 2 cents or a penny or even less than that to use the roadways. So you can see there's a big swing in how much each of us as individuals are paying for our highways. And while the gas tax worked really well when it was created, because, you know, basically there weren't a lot of choices in the kinds of cars we could buy, and they all got about the same miles per gallon. And there certainly wasn't options of alternative fuels. So everybody was, you know, kind of in that same ballpark in terms of what we were paying. Today, this is no longer the case. And so road charging is a way to level that playing field. And as you can see here, we chart here the cost of road charging versus gas tax by car type. Because what we've learned in our research is that the impact road charging is going to have on you financially is not going to be determined by whether you're a rural resident or an urban resident, or frankly, how far you drive. It's going to be determined by your car's MPG. Today, if you're in a rural area and you drive a car that's not very fuel efficient, you're buying a lot of gas today and you're paying a lot of gas tax. We don't feel it because it's embedded in that gas price, but drivers are paying a lot. So as you can see here on this chart, to the far left, we've got an older Ford F-150 pickup truck that gets 15 miles per gallon. Compared to the gas tax, the road charge, they'd be paying about $9 less a month on the road charge program. And again, this to simplify this, we assumed 1,000 miles per month in the calculations. If you move over and look at that 2016 Toyota Prius that gets about 50 miles per gallon, we've layered in that hybrid vehicle fee of $75. Even with that, under a road charge program, they would see about an $8 increase per month in taxes paid. And of course, EVs would see about a $5 per month increase in the amount of taxes they're paying for the use of the roads. But this is really just capturing the tax impact. Environmental groups had issues with this chart when we started using it in the beginning because they said, well, it looks to me like you're really just encouraging people to drive gas, gasoline emitting vehicles, and you're going to reward them. That certainly is not the intent. And so we came up with this chart, which really tells the more full picture of the cost of ownership. On this chart, it's the same cars plotted across the bottom there, but we layer in the cost of fuel, which is a real cost that consumers must deal with in driving their vehicles. And we certainly, when we fill up, don't sit there and think about how much did the oil company get versus our state government or the federal government for our highways. But as you can see here on this chart, everybody's got that flat RUC fee assessed at the top, but you can see the real swing is around the amount of fuel that drivers will have to continue to purchase at gas stations. And in that light, you can see that the Prius drivers still enjoy a significant cost advantage over someone that's driving an older vehicle that is not very fuel efficient. So we don't see road charging being a detriment or a disincentive to move to a more fuel efficient vehicle or to an EV. And in fact, the legislature could further incentivize this transition by simply charging a lower per mile rate for electric vehicles and hybrids if they so choose. So a little bit on the RUC pilot participant. This was the data from the 3 surveys that we conducted. One of the questions we asked was, how do you feel about implementing a RUC to replace the gas tax? And you can see in the blue, the survey 1 response at the beginning of the pilot. There was a lot of need more information, we're not sure. And you can see that the strongly support and somewhat support bars were significant, but definitely grew as you look at survey 3 and compare that. Definitely what we learned, and we know this from other states' experiences, that when people really experience this program and see how it works and the true impacts to them personally, people become a lot more supportive of it. Based on the experience in the pilot, we asked how their attitude towards the RUC system has changed. And as you can see, we have nearly half the drivers saying they were a little more supportive, with about 36% saying it stayed where they were when they started the pilot. We asked them which of the following best represents their advice to elected officials as they consider next steps in implementing a statewide RUC system. Interestingly, 33% of our drivers said that they thought it should be phased in over the next 5 to 10 years, but we had 28% who said it should be implemented as soon as possible. When you combine those, that's a pretty strong sense of urgency from 2,000 drivers. The other interesting thing to note is we kind of expected drivers to say, yeah, do it, but make the EV drivers pay, make somebody else pay, but don't make me pay. But actually, there really wasn't a lot of support. Only 9% suggested that it only be applied to electric vehicles, and only 19% said, maybe limit its application to the hybrids. We asked our drivers, knowing what they know today, which method to fund transportation would they prefer. That top line bar represents the first survey. Of course, the last survey is the bottom bar there. And you can see there was a fair amount of growth in preference for the road charge. Gas tax, equally preferring RUC and gas tax, rose to about 15%. And then, there was still a strong level of support for the gas tax, right? Even though it's not sustainable, of course, we all like it. But overall, we saw a lot of growth in preference here. So getting to the commission's recommendations, after 12 years, not 12 years, it feels like 12 years, 7 years of research, the commission submitted its set of findings and recommendations to the legislature this January, and also submitted it to USDOT and Congress. And basically the hallmark recommendation is that the legislature begin a gradual transition now, but start small. So if you can imagine this session, it'll be a topic. And if they were to succeed in authorizing a program this year, it really wouldn't start until 2023 because there is about a 2-year window that we need to lift the program and get it going. So you can see there that number 2, we would start with the plug-in electrics, hybrids, and we want to pull in the state agency vehicle fleet, which is where we can also get a lot of information and experience as state employees drive all over the state in their state vehicles. We estimate that about 10 years later, we will be ready to really extend it to all passenger vehicles. But that assumes that step 3 happens in the middle there around 2026, where once we start that small program and it runs for a few years, that's about when the gas tax is expected to start really noticeably tipping down. And that is when the legislature will need to start considering dialing up the expansion of road charging and kind of dialing down the number of cars that are still going to continue to pay the gas tax. The lower portion of this chart really just shows you some other things that are happening on a parallel basis. The state and our organization received another $5 million in federal dollars to continue our research on road charging impacts regarding equity, to continue our exploration on technology and driving our costs down. So that's going to continue to be in play and will be done right around the time a program would be starting and could further inform those policies. We also note at the very bottom there, you'll see a dot at 2025, which is where the state's Clean Vehicle Incentive Program will sunset. So that is when those rebates that drivers can get today for buying EVs will go away. And that's notable as well. The commission also made a number of policy recommendations. These are just a few highlights on privacy. They strongly urge the legislature to enact laws that will protect personal privacy as soon as they authorize a program, even if it's small. We need to have those laws on the book, and they need to be quite stringent to ensure that data is protected and that access to any data that's collected would be done under very limited cases. Use of revenue, the commission recommends that the legislature subject road usage charge revenues to be placed under the 18th Amendment restriction, just like the gas tax is. But it also encourages the legislature to identify a separate dedicated funding source for our multimodal transportation needs in public transportation, which has never been addressed since the legislature repealed the motor vehicle excise tax back in 2000. Some other refinements need to continue happening while we think about starting a very small scale program. A lot of this will be addressed in our ongoing research, but we need to find new approaches to privacy protection and continue to evolve that as technology advances. We're going to be working with other states on compliance gaps. Border area testing must continue. And we need to leverage our private sector partners to help us lift a broader scale program as we think about this going statewide, maybe in the next decade. To the research program that we have just started with the current federal grant, we're going to be looking at new mobility and developing a pretty rigorous model that will be able to help the state better estimate the impacts of future trends on our revenues. So as we think about road charging, we need to make sure that it really is going to be sustainable long-term as we think about autonomous vehicles, growth in rideshare, changes in possible car ownership. At least in our urban areas, we know the automakers are looking at offering subscription approaches as opposed to buying a car. You have a subscription and you get a car when you need it, or you change your car depending on the time of year. There's all sorts of interesting things emerging that suggest we could see VMT drop and we could see car ownership shift quite a bit. We're going to also be spending a fair amount of time looking at the impacts of road charging on underrepresented communities. We're going to be looking at updating and continually exploring technology and new ways to report miles. We know new cars today have a lot of telematics that would enable a driver to transmit their miles directly from their car and not have to plug in any device if they wanted, or do an odometer read if they so choose. So there's also explorations we want to do at pay at the pump. So rather than drivers getting an invoice, maybe someday we can get it back to being transactional. Every time you fill up, your road charges get added on. That needs a lot of work that we'll be researching. We'll also be working with other states on cost of reduction. There's no question that there will be nothing that will be as cheap to collect as the gas tax. It costs less than 1% to collect the gas tax. We can't even collect a licensing fee today for even close to that low level. But we know for RUC, it's more like tolling. We're looking at around 15 to 18% cost of collection. Those administrative costs are too high. We want to get those down. We need to get those down. We think as this scales up, those costs will go down. Obviously, it costs a lot more money to collect from a small pool of drivers than it will from 7 million or from, let's say, California, Oregon, and Washington, where now you have over 100 million drivers that you're collecting from. But there's things we can be doing today in our startup programs that we want to explore with our partner states in Oregon and Utah to figure out how we can get those costs down. We'll be looking at a detailed phase-in plan that will take into account the results of our modeling around new mobility and how people may change how they get around over the course of the next 30 years. We'll be doing some further, we call them sub-tests. We will do some more pilot testing, but they will be small pools of drivers that will be focused on testing maybe one aspect of road charging as opposed to the end-to-end experience we did in our pilot in 2018. And lastly, we'll be giving the legislature a detailed roadmap, an idea, basically a plan for the transition from gas tax to road charging over the course of the next 10 to 15 years, with all of this additional research further informing how that transition should be looked at. This is just a simple snapshot of the work flow that's going to be happening through this research. It'll wrap up in 2023. And as you can see below, this research hopefully will be happening in parallel to a launch of a very small scale program. So we'll be getting experience in a real program, collecting real money, hopefully from about 4% of our drivers in the state. Meanwhile, we'll be doing this research that will further inform the legislature's plans and thoughts around how they may want to scale that program out over the course of the next 10 years. This is where you can go to get more information on our road usage charge website. Everything is on there from the last 7 years. Our steering committee continues to meet. So if you want to stay abreast and see what the latest information is, you can go to this website. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Do we have questions? You addressed one of my primary concerns, and that was the cost of administration. And I believe you said right now it would be about 18% more than the minimal amount that we have to collect the gas tax. Mm-hmm. So when you looked at that 2.4 cents per mile, that did not include the 18% cost of administration.
That is correct. That is an equivalent rate to what drivers are paying for the gas tax today. So yes.
Is there anyone else who has a question or comments? David Garlington. I'm not seeing everyone, so just feel free to jump in. But David, I do see you.
Yeah, thank you. I was just curious, you showed the stats of electric vehicle sales once they reach that equalization point will take off. Is anything being looked at what pressure that puts on the electrical grid? How is that going to affect the electrical availability and the cost of electricity?
Well, that's a little bit out of the purview of the commission, but we have had conversations, and we know enough to know that the utility sector is very looped in and preparing for this growth and anticipated plans of the automakers to go electric. They believe the grid can carry it. The way grids have advanced with their technology, there's ability to shift load. There's different ways to ensure that it doesn't drag the grid down, so to speak. I think there were questions a decade ago of whether or not we could sustain it. But in our conversations now, it appears the utility sector is not concerned or has issues with the notion of, vehicle fleets across the country fully electrifying at some point.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if we might have the presentation sent to us via email.
Yes, Sarah has it, and I encourage you guys to share it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And just so everybody knows, we will send this out, and then we're also recording it. So, because sometimes when you just see the slides, it might be helpful to have Reema's explanation. So we'll have links to both of those for you.
Will you be
Just a quick
on our website?
Yeah, yes, we'll have it on the website too. We'll link on the website as well. Yeah.
Okay.
I just had a quick question. Yeah. So if you could just explain it to me. So say I charge my car at home and then I'm traveling. Am I only paying when I use these stations? Like, am I not paying as I charge at home?
It's not tied to your charging function. It would be charged to the miles you drive on your vehicle.
Okay. So it would like check that when I signed in
Right.
at home from the last time I used it?
Well, per those approaches we've tested, it could be your smartphone that's collecting your miles. It could be a plug-in device, or if your car has telematics, your car's telematics would be basically remitting those miles. Or you could just take pictures of your odometer on a quarterly basis and you get the total miles driven. So that's how we're looking at it today. We recognize technology is, accelerating at an increasing pace every day. I'm sure there's going to be other ways of doing this as we continue this process. But for today, that's kind of the options that are available to us in terms of remitting miles.
Yeah, I was just curious if perhaps maybe like a once a year when you do your inspection or something might be a way to determine how many miles, or if you for taxes or whatnot.
Absolutely. And that's really the cheapest and easiest way is, you renew your tabs, you do an odometer read, right? You just pay on your miles. But for people that drive out of state a lot, or maybe they have a farm and they put a lot of miles on their vehicle off road, they may not want to pay on all those miles. So they might have an interest in having that GPS ability to distinguish when I'm literally on a public road in our state. So that, it's not going to be a one size fits all for everybody, which is why it's so important the legislature, if they start this program, that they give drivers a choice of how they want to participate, so that they can kind of do what's comfortable for them.
I think Marty has a question. Did you have a question or a comment, Marty?
Yes, I do. Our tribe has a store with a gas station out here, and we depend on those taxes from the gas for some of our programs. I was just wondering, have you guys discussed on how this will affect the tribes that do collect gas taxes?
Yeah, and I will note we have a representative, a tribal representative on our steering committee that has been involved, and I've spoken at the Tribal Transportation Planning Conference a few times. So we love the engagement And there's been some really good pieces of information and perspectives that have come up over the years. So what I would say for the startup is what we've recommended the legislature do is leave all current distributions and compacts, the process of the compacts in place during the transitionary period. So that could be, let's say a decade or more, where things need to kind of stay the same while road charging is a very small percentage of our revenue. But as they consider someday dialing that up and expanding it across the state to more and more drivers, these issues around revenue distribution, whether it's to tribes or to cities or to counties, will be a topic of discussion for them to wrestle with about, do they change their distribution mechanisms or don't they? Do they keep everything as is? That would be our suggestion. But I think for now, there will not be any disruption, at least during the first 10 years or so as this thing gets going, because it's going to be a very slow startup. But in the future, those discussions will have to be had.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions or comments?
Yeah, I've got a question, Reema.
Thank you.
So I think I'm understanding this. Would this would be a method of adjusting the taxes that you've paid in the gas tax, and the gas tax would remain there at the pump, which would then capture reasonably well out-of-state drivers that come in. Is
Exactly.
that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got it. You got it exactly. I didn't make that as explicit as I should have. But during this transition, you'll have the gas tax being collected parallel to the RUC. So if I'm on the RUC system, when I'm filling up my car, I'm still paying gas tax.
Right.
So basically, you look at those gas taxes as prepayments to your road charges, and you get
Yeah.
that's how it worked in the pilot. Drivers got a credit for their gas taxes paid. They saw it on their invoice, as well as how many miles they drove, and then they saw what RUC charges they had. Or, in the case of inefficient vehicles, they were showing credits because they had overpaid.
Right.
Which is another issue the legislature will have to think about in the future as they scale up in the context of the fleet transition. So when you have those vehicles that are gas guzzlers, so to speak, do you move them over? Do you leave them on the gas tax? And we've said leave the gas tax in place until it dies. It's cheap to collect, and it's an elegant solution to out-of-state travel and tax evasion, right? Because I might be able to try to game the RUC system that I'm still paying my gas tax every time I fill up. So I'm not going to get too far in my ability to evade my taxes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that was a very, very good and thorough presentation. I really appreciated it. It was well done.
It's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, and I do know that we have some time issues, but I wanted to ask Mr. Claussen if he wanted to ask the question regarding if the road usage charge was subject to the 18th Amendment, what other revenue sources may be available for multimodal and transit?
Well, I heard, Reema, you indicated that was part of the discussion of the funding that would be collected would remain under the 18th Amendment. So the funding that's derived from gas tax currently cannot be used in some of those categories that you mentioned, Beck. So
right.
I know that as a transit industry, we've asked the legislators that we've talked with that whatever new funding they come up with, that they should be trying to make sure that it's not covered under the 18th Amendment. So it does have the flexibility to support these other
Absolutely.
non-motorized types of funding needs.
And the commission has been for years harping on the legislature about replacing the MVET. I mean, ever since the MVET went away, it gutted all the flexible money we had as a state for transit and ferries, and a number of safety enforcement. I mean, it really pulled the rug out from under us, and they've never solved or gone back to figure out, so what do we do now that this is gone? So it's left a big vacuum. And the reason the commission landed on their recommendation that road charging revenue be dedicated under the 18th Amendment was because it's been cast as a replacement to the gas tax. And there is, we know from history that it's important to have a dedicated source for infrastructure. Otherwise, it easily gets watered down and spread about all sorts of uses. And the highways have a hard time maybe competing. So it's important that those revenues be dedicated. And as long as there's a shortage of revenue, which we know our system is woefully behind and its investment needs on preservation and maintenance, we're funding at half of what we should be. So our system's kind of crumbling slowly. And so until we catch up, you know, the commission's saying we don't have any extra money to cut this pie up in 14 ways. It really shouldn't be cut up. It needs to go to infrastructure and ferries. And then if the day comes where we have extra revenue, certainly look at those other flexible appropriations. But in the meantime, we're pushing them to really today to find a source that will take care of multimodal needs. It's not to say they're not important. It's just that you can't add more people to the same source and expect to get any satisfaction, because then everybody gets a watered down small amount of money. It has to be divided so many ways. If you can find a dedicated source, the commission is frankly advocating, and will be advocating again this year, and they proposed it in their 2015 revenue proposal, that they reinstate some form of a value-based tax on vehicles, and they don't have to call it an MVET. It certainly could be restructured at a much lower level at say 1% instead of the 2.2. There was a lot of things they could have done to fix it and make it more fair and less regressive, but the current flat fees people are paying are regressive, we have not improved the situation. So to bring back some value-based tax, we're calling it a transportation improvement fee, brings in over $500 million a year, which would be a huge infusion of revenue for transit and ferries and law enforcement and maintenance and preservation potentially if the gas tax can't cover it. But we're advocating that they roll back a number of their vehicle license fees they've put in place and really come in with a single source that will generate the kinds of revenues we need to address transit and our other multimodal needs. So, you know, that's the MVET's a 4-letter word in our state, but it's really we've got to come to the realization that there's no golden ticket out there that's going to solve it unless we really look at 1 or 2 or 3 of the known big generators of revenue.
I understand that and certainly support whatever they come up with. I think personally, one of the big challenges that were created from people loving MVET is the fact that it piles up and they get to pay it once a year, where it becomes noticeable.
Exactly.
Where if you were to take that same amount and allow folks to pay it monthly, I don't think you'd have quite the
totally agree
that you have now.
Yes, that's one of the changes we recommend. The other is to assess it a year after you buy your car if you get a new car. So, you know, the old MVET was 2.2% and you got assessed it before you drove off the lot. And we all know if we drive that car off the lot, it depreciates a lot. So there was that kind of perception that it wasn't fair. It was like I'm being overtaxed out the gate. And then the depreciation schedule had issues. The depreciation schedule has been fixed for Sound Transit, but we think there's ways it could be done better and bring in those vital revenues that we have lost and never been able to replace. And all these nickel and dime fees aren't going to cut it.
Thank you, Reema.
Yeah.
I believe we all agree with your last comments.
Good.
We have time for maybe one more question, because if we're going to adjourn on time, and I know there's some agenda items that we're probably going to ask you we will condense them significantly. Does anyone have one last question? If not, I will thank Reema and Tamara very much for joining us this morning. We appreciate your time and your presentation. It was very educational.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us, and we'll come back. You know, maybe after session we'll have something to report.
Thank you, Reema.
All right. Happy holidays, everybody.